All right, everyone. Thank you so much for hanging in with us. I just want to do a quick announcement on CLEs. For folks who are looking for CLE credit for the opening plenary, your code word number 1 is human, and your code word number 2 is housing. All right, we're going to get started. And thank you all of the panelists for joining. I know that we still are milling about, so I am going to, we're going to close the doors and all right, we're going to close the doors and we're going to introduce the panelists. My name is Tristia Bauman. I'm a senior attorney at the National Homelessness Law Center. Thank you all for coming. I know it's been a long day. We've heard a lot of great content, and we have one final session for you today. I am going to talk about countering criminalization of homelessness. This is an area where I focus, where the law center's focused, and I know where a lot of you are focused. I am going to try to navigate the technology. Thank you for bearing with us with this virtual event that has an in-person component. And I am going to begin a quick slideshow. Then I'll introduce a great set of panelists and we'll ask some questions and move forward. All right, so first, we're here to talk about countering criminalization of homelessness. If you know the Law Center, then you know that we have been tracking criminalization policies for a very long time, well over a decade. Since 2006, we have tracked 187 cities around the country and watched as their codes that criminalize survival conduct have grown. You can read our Housing Not Handcuffs 2019 report, and some of these images reveal what we have found. About 3/4 of cities have some law that criminalizes survival in public space, and other types of survival activity is criminalized. It is primarily something that exists at the city level, the local level, but not exclusively. We also published a state supplemental report in 2021. Again, you can read that report on our website. And what we found is that the majority of states have some law that criminalizes homelessness and survival conduct. These things are not new, but what is new is the Cicero Institute. This is a new group that is using the same old, stale, failed policy approaches to homelessness, and they are pushing it in a way that is organized and is gaining ground. And it's our challenge to step up and stop this emerging threat. So let's take a look at the Cicero Institute model policy on homelessness. What does it do? It says a few different things. You can read the model policy on their website, but I want to highlight 3 key features. 1, it outlaws survival. It prohibits unauthorized sleeping. No human being can forego sleep. We know that. We all slept. We're all going to sleep later on today. That is a way to make homelessness illegal, to criminalize human beings. It also criminalizes other acts of survival that human beings have engaged in since the dawn of time, like sheltering yourself. What's another thing that the Cicero Institute model policy does? It sets up a system of corralling, segregating, and abandoning people in a setting that none of us would recognize as being reflective of the human right to housing. It moves people into camps, and we know that that is the goal and the intent. We hear that in the talking points that are being drummed at every possible opportunity, including by our former president. It institutionalizes people. It requires a coercive approach to mental health treatment. And if you fail to comply with a court-ordered treatment plan, you again will end up in a cage. This is their solution that they call a compassionate solution to addressing homelessness. And it's gaining ground. It's gaining a lot of traction. I've listed the states where these laws, where something premised on the Cicero Institute's model policy have been introduced or enacted. There are people who are here in this room who live in states where this bill is now law, and it's being enforced directly against people or threatened against people every day as I speak. Now, what is the result? The result is that unhoused people are involved in the criminal legal system. That's old. We know that that's happening. In Portland, about half of the arrests are of unhoused people. Same thing in San Diego. You could list the cities, it'll be the same thing. When you involve unhoused people in the criminal legal system, you raise the prospect that people will be brutalized by our militarized police force. In Los Angeles, about 1/3 of use of force incidents involve unhoused people, even though unhoused people make up a very small segment of the population. We also know that it perpetuates systemic racism, ableism, and oppression, dehumanization of people. And that is not by accident. The messages are designed to do that. Prager University is putting out content. Is Mark Horvath still in the room? How many millions?
50 videos a day.
50 videos a day, pumping these dehumanizing messages that justify these policies. Is this new? No, it is not new. The law has been weaponized against marginalized people since the founding of this country. Since European colonists came to this land, took the property, called it theirs, and then described this land as uninhabited. The law has been weaponized against people based on their identity. And how do we know that? Well, let's take a look at the facts. Now, as you heard Mark Doan say earlier, there are realities that we create, and that is true. But there are some things that we can study that are objective facts. Black and brown people are stopped, searched, and cited more than white people for the same crimes. The research shows that. That's plain, that's clear. We know that. We know it's wrong, but we perpetuate it. Is that new? No, it's not new. We just take a look at the history of some of the laws that have been used against Black and brown people and that have been used against poor people in this country. Let's take a look at the history of vagrancy laws. Vagrancy laws came with the European colonists from medieval England. They came as part of a system where race was baked into the law through a system of slavery, where stolen lives were used to be laborers that created wealth for white-owned systems. And those laborers, when freedom came, were subject to vagrancy laws that were enacted in the post-slavery era as vagrancy laws to capture them, to cage them, to again force their labor to enrich white-owned systems. That's the history of vagrancy in this country. Those laws continued to be enforced until the 1970s. Now, the US Supreme Court described these laws as a convenient tool for rounding up politically undesirable people, and that's exactly what they were intended to do. And it's not just the history of vagrancy laws. Another example, the history of ugly laws. These are laws that came from the 1860s into the 20th century that were forms of legal discrimination designed to keep disabled and destitute people off of the streets and out of public view. Does that sound familiar? That's the legacy. That's the legacy that criminalization policies are built on. And what do we see in that legacy? We see poor Black and brown people put in these cages. We see poor people living in tents. And the threat of those cages and the threat of that loss of tent is what policies like the Cicero Institute's model policy are designed to do, so that we can control people, control whether they are even allowed to exist in our communities. Now, we are powerful when we work together. We here do not fight for an end to the criminalization of homelessness. We fight for liberation for all people. We don't fight for an end to homelessness. We fight for human rights and human dignity for all people. And that's when we're powerful. We are powerful as the people, and organized, we can be powerful. but it's important that we don't use a colorblind lens. And it's important that we don't ignore the history that these laws are founded upon. I'm going to start with one of our very esteemed panelists, Earl Edwards. Earl, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I'd like for you to introduce yourself to this group and then help us understand why, even though we're fighting for mass liberation and for human dignity for all, why it's important we don't take a colorblind approach.
First, I just want to take a moment to really appreciate your introduction and how you frame the conversation. I think it's really important when we think about homelessness, we think about it from a broader perspective and from something that's been going on in our country since the beginning. So myself, my name is Earl Edwards. I'm a assistant professor at Boston College in the School of Education. I really kind of started to do work around homelessness as a result of my experience in schools and interacting with the McKinney Mental Homeless Assistance Act as a policy in schools. To better understand kind of that policy, I went back to explore kind of what was the conversations that were happening that enacted that policy to actually be in place. And so during that time period, I went to school, graduate school of education at UCLA, and I did a lot of work in LA County. And so I was a part of the ad hoc on Black people experiencing homelessness that was established in Los Angeles, and also worked with the Homeless Initiative, really looking at kind of how racialized homelessness is impacting Black people in the county. And so just the context, when thinking about homelessness, a recent conception of homelessness, there was a study that studied and surveyed individuals ages 51 to 68 and asked them if they experienced homelessness any time in their life. And what the survey kind of showed was 1 in 20 white Americans experience homelessness at any point in their life. And they self-disclosed that they experienced homelessness. For Latinx, it was 1 in 12. And for African Americans, it was 1 in 6. And that's a really important piece of context because that allows us to recognize that this is an issue that a lot of Black people have within their families and have within their actual ways of being as a result of the criminalization that we talked about going back to the history of the United States. Now, homelessness can happen to anyone. Mental health is the leading cause of individual experiencing homelessness. Bad luck can cause someone to fall into homelessness. And homelessness is a structural class-based issue. These are all true. These are all arguments that were used in the 80s to really advocate for the McKinney Mental Homeless Assistance Act and to push forward policies around ending homelessness. However, it failed to recognize that race also played a role in the perpetuation of homelessness within our cities and within our country. And as a result of that, it invalidated the Black experiences and the issues that were actually happening as a result that was causing Black people to fall into homelessness. So racial covenants wasn't talked about as being a part of why individuals were actually falling into homelessness. Blockbusting that was devaluing Black communities and also pushing people out. Redlining, urban renewal, racial displacement. The subprime loan discrimination that happened. A lot of individuals in places like Compton and Inglewood left their homes to actually go buy property, and then the market crashed. And those individuals not only had bad credit and couldn't rent, but also lost their homes. And a lot of those individuals fell into homelessness. Housing discrimination and employment discrimination. We have shelter systems designed with this idea that if you have a short-term solution, you're able to get a job and you're able to move forward. It doesn't account for the discrimination that happens when Black people are trying to get jobs, or when individuals are trying to get housed and landlords and property managers are discriminating against Black people, making it hard for them to actually get actual housing. Family displacement, and also thinking about this not only within the criminal justice system, but how criminalization is happening across institutions. So this chart is showing the During the same time period in the 1960s, there was also a rise in the foster care system in terms of Black kids being taken away from their families. There was a rise in prison population, but also there was an increase in the Black suspension rate going on under the premise of this underclass group that were actually creating kids that would later on become what Hillary Clinton referred to as super predators, right? And so this framing of Black people being the face of homelessness was running rampant. However, our solutions in terms of policy solutions didn't include them in the actual initiation of it. And so I wrote a paper kind of talking about dual public identity and how we had two actual images of what homelessness looked like. Advocates were actually pushing for this everyday people kind of framework in terms of anyone can fall into homelessness, and therefore everyone should care about it because it could happen to you, it could happen to your loved one. And we also had this underclass frame that would actually ignore that actually was being pushed by both liberals and also conservatives about individuals not wanting to be a part of society and therefore wanting to be on the street. And therefore things like criminalizing them, forcing them into places into care were solutions that they saw as being viable and actually helpful. The problem was when we looked at the everyday people kind of framework and used that, it didn't negate the fact that this underclass frame was already existing and was already perpetuating itself. And so what happened is that's a double impact on Black people who were experiencing homelessness. You might get in a homeless shelter, take you too long to get out of it, and now you're being criminalized because now people think you're lazy or something's going on with you, which is why you're in those situations again. And you have less of there's less goodwill. So now you get into, for example, permanent supported housing, and you get evicted because individuals feel like you're threatening or you're making them feel uncomfortable. When I was in LA, I worked with a California Policy Lab, and we did a study kind of exploring why Black single adult residents were leaving interim permanent supported housing and falling back into interim housing or falling back into street homelessness. And one thing that came up was the people that were getting into permanent supported housing that were Black, they were being criminalized within those institutions. So the same nonprofit organizations that were there to help them were also creating tension that made them actually want to leave and feel like being on the street or being in interim housing was a better option than being in some of the permanent supported housing opportunities that they were actually being given. This is really important because the same things, right, was coming up in their conversation. So this one woman said they're prejudiced. They don't know how to talk to you, and you're seen as being drug addicts. We're seen as mental. We're seen as lazy baby getters. They don't see us. And this was in 2021, and she's using terms that were literally being used against individuals experiencing homelessness in the 80s. It really kind of shows that we have to push back against this criminalization that's happening and these policies that are trying to criminalize individuals, but also be very, very critical in terms of the policy we have in place now that are also perpetuating the criminalization and this framework around criminalizing and othering individuals that are experiencing homelessness. It's leading to exacerbation of individuals, Black people particularly, on the streets, and it reiterating and justifying the policies that we're trying to fight against. I just want to kind of frame that around that. Some solutions is targeted universalism. Really thinking about how do we recognize we have a broad, it can happen to everybody, but also recognize it's happening to everyone in different ways and have targeted actual strategies to actually address it. LA County did have an ad hoc report, we had recommendations. However, the political will to actually utilize those recommendations has been questionable. Considering the lives of people with lived experience. People with lived experience has to be not only hired, developed, and promoted, they have to be leading. They have to be leading the actual policies and actual work. Our panel, we have individual lived experience. Myself, I experienced homelessness for 6 years when I was growing up. We exist, we have agency, we can do it. However, we need the opportunity to actually be able to show that. And we need to emphasize qualitative analysis. Right now, we emphasize too much the HMIS systems that don't capture the real experiences of individuals. And we're limited in terms of what we know based on the administrative questions that we're asking and based on the caseworker that's actually implementing those tools. We need to listen to the people, and the people that should be asking those questions should be people with lived experience as well. And lastly, we have to tether our systems together and recognize that we cannot fight homelessness without fighting against the criminal justice system, without fighting against the privatization of our public school systems that are gentrifying our communities, that's making it harder for individuals to actually maintain and keep their homes and housing. One of the biggest issues I think we had, and especially in the 60s and 70s, is that we did not separate. We separated civil rights movement and the Black freedom movement from the housing movement. Those two are extremely important and are connected. And as a result of that, things like housing discrimination wasn't a strong enough emphasis on the housing justice front. And so we need to have those tethered together, and we need to make sure we're showing our advocacy by working together and also working as coalitions. So I will leave it there and look forward to answering more questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Earl. And that's a great segue into our next speaker, Councilman Bauman, who is also one of our honorees at today's awards event. He's been a council member in LA for 13 years. And the question to you is, how has LA's history of segregation, which is a policy response encouraged by the Cicero Institute that is inherent in criminalization policies, how has that contributed to LA's homelessness crisis?
Thank you. Thank you. The short answer is directly and in every way possible. It's really kind of hard to add anything to what Professor Edwards just said. I mean, he not only did he lay it out just sort of nationally, but he also brought the Los Angeles context and was one of a panel that did phenomenal work on a special committee report on Black homelessness in Los Angeles, and he shared some of those findings with you. What I'll talk about, since he did such a great job answering that question, is a little bit of the context of it and some of the ways in which it's applied. So I've been on the council 9.5 years, not 13, thank God, and I will be done in 25 days. And in the time I have been there is no issue that we have discussed for more days, for more hours, with more frequency than criminalization of homelessness in every form imaginable. Living in your vehicle, sleeping in a park, setting up a tent on a sidewalk, again and again and again and again. And it dwarfs the amount of time that we've spent talking about housing. It dwarfs the amount of time we have spent trying to get people off the street. And there was a version of our homelessness criminalization ordinance that was proposed a couple years ago. And it was the worst of all the versions I'd ever seen. We managed to beat some of this back. But there was a provision in it that not only would say you can't sleep here, you can't lie here, but there was a provision in it that says it would ban individuals in the public right of way from engaging in certain aggressive behavior, including approaching, following closely, or speaking to a person in a way that makes them feel fearful or causes them to take evasive action to avoid physical contact. You showed the slides about Jim Crow laws. There's nobody in this room who doesn't understand that would not have been applied equally, that would have been applied in a racially discriminatory manner. That was seriously discussed by the city council, and it took the effort of me and a number of my African-American colleagues to explain to the proponents of this ordinance that this was inherently racist and would have a horrible impact upon people based on the color of their skin. It was sort of a Karen enabling law. Anything Karen was afraid of would be subject to arrest. And it came from, now we have criminalization laws that are now in effect, and they're actually, as you indicated from the stuff about Cicero, they are now mapped very well in the framework of compassion. It is inhumane for people to have to live on the streets, so therefore we should make it illegal to live on the streets. And they totally skip over where they go when they're not on the streets. But that has gained a lot of power, a lot of momentum. It's been voiced by a lot of people who otherwise describe themselves as progressive or liberals. in Los Angeles, and it's become a very, very strong and powerful argument. And it's actually now, criminalization is actually baked in the city of Los Angeles to a legal settlement the city has just gotten involved in, and Shayla Myers over here has been fighting it very hard, that the city has been a party to, which theoretically commits the city to provide some housing and shelter, but it is nothing but a pretext to expand criminalization around the city. This applies in so many different ways. We have been fighting in Los Angeles to keep people housed. We've been fighting to do a lot of the things that they are doing in Washington State, the right to counsel and the just cause eviction. We have been trying to provide renter relief. But there are so many additional barriers that people who are Black and homeless face to get housed. And because we have so many policymakers who tend to make policy from a colorblind perspective, they fail to see what those barriers and what those hurdles are. So we have a proposal before the council now, which tries to help people get housed, to remove one of the barriers. And one of the barriers is that people do criminal background checks. Another barrier is that they do credit checks, even though your rental history has nothing to do with your credit score. And those are absolutely, it's well documented, applied in a way that severely impacts people of color more than people who are white. And that's just one of the barriers we need to take down. But it's pervasive and it's expanding. The good news I will share with people, so I always like to leave a question on good news, is the guy who sponsored the sort of the Jim Crow ordinance was just defeated for re-election. He conceded yesterday by a progressive, a socialist who's opposed to criminalization. One of his chief co-sponsors was defeated for re-election a couple months ago by an avowed abolitionist. And so things are starting to change, and I have hope that we will begin to turn this around.
Thank you, Mike. Next, we're going to turn to David Peary, who is an attorney and community activist. I'm going to try to pull up his PowerPoint presentation, but lest we think that the issues of criminalization of homelessness are inherent only in the Western United States, we're going across the country to Florida and Miami-Dade, where David works. And David, let me see if I can do this. Eric?
Oh, I got one. Superman.
Thank you. Oh, and actually, I will take this opportunity to give the first CLE word. So for folks who are looking for CLE credit, CLE word number 1, counter. Counter.
What is it?
Counter.
You don't need that in the room. Only if you're grateful.
Oh.
There we go.
I think there's something signed in. So if you're in the room and you want CLD credit, make sure you sign in on a paper. Does anyone need it?
Just to be sure everybody heard that, if you are in the room and you want CLE credit, be sure to sign in. And there will be CLE credit offered tomorrow as well. So I'll be looking out for those sign-in sheets and for the words. And thank you very much, Eric, for saving the day.
Yes. Fantastic.
Thank you. And now David Peary, thank you so much. Would you like to be here? And
Yes.
here's the clip.
Great. Hopefully I'll have the right direction. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. We're in the 7th inning stretch. Okay. So I think there's 1 or 2 more speakers after me. So we're almost done. It's been a long day. So thank you. So yes, I'm David Peary from Miami, Florida. Yes, I do have a law degree, but the most important credential in my lifetime is the credential I have from having a lived experience of homelessness. And so because of a bizarre set of circumstances, I found myself homeless in Miami, Florida, sleeping on the concrete, sleeping on the sidewalk. And this was relatively recent, up until the mid 2000s. So I consider that to be far more important than a JD degree. What I'm going to talk about today is take things away from like the 30-foot level, 30,000-foot level, take it right down to the concrete. Okay, I'm going to present a case study, if you will, on a successful grassroots organizing strategy protest that we had to defeat a component of the Cicero Institute's really noxious template legislation that's sweeping around the country. It's a very interesting example of grassroots organizing. It's an interesting example of a multi-pronged strategy that we use, where we assembled a multiracial coalition of organizations, of groups, including groups that really don't give a damn about poor people or homeless people at all. They're motivated more by NIMBYism, okay, not my backyard. But even we were taking advantage of that singular self-interest to include them into our fold. And we educated a fair number of them. And we actually had many people who were not involved in the homelessness movement who joined our coalition, and they're still sticking around. So this little bright ray of sunshine, I hope to be an encouraging note at this late part of this seminar here. So let's talk a little bit about the context of homelessness policy in Miami. There's a national strategy called the no handcuffs or the housing strategy. I call Miami's policy the handcuffs with no housing strategy. And this really took off after the termination of what's known as a Pottinger consent decree. Without going into details, I think many of you are familiar with the Pottinger federal consent decree. Essentially, it was a consent decree that was entered into about 22 years ago, that dictated how Miami police were to interact with the homeless. So when they encountered somebody experiencing homelessness who was engaged in a life-sustaining activity connected to a misdemeanor, like public trespass, sleeping in public, relieving yourself in public, discreetly, eating in public, littering, things like that, then they're not supposed to arrest the person if shelter wasn't available. They're supposed to inquire whether shelter is first available and transport that person to shelter. After some 20 years, the city of Miami successfully got a court to terminate that policy based upon Miami's promises that it's seen the error of its ways and that it would no longer criminalize homelessness. Barely 6 months, I think it was actually 3 months after the federal court terminated the Pottinger consent decree, Miami engaged in this series of actions here. If I can, oops, I got the right. This. Oh, there we go. There we go. Okay, so first series of actions started in 2008. They escalated the criminalization of homelessness by creating a police unit called the Heat Unit. This has nothing to do with the basketball team, nothing to do with the weather. This was an elite police unit that's specifically directed to going to homeless encampment to encampment to encampment, destroying everybody's property, throwing everything away, and basically traumatizing the homeless. The next thing they did was to try to choke off the supply of food in Miami. They enacted what's known as a large group feeding ordinance that basically was using hunger as a weapon against the poor. Not enough to destroy their property, not enough to starve them. Then they passed a law, which is really the first part of the Cicero prong, to ban sleeping in public, where something as simple as a piece of cardboard propped up against a fence could be deemed to be a homeless encampment that would then allow police to arrest you or to hit you with a $250 fine. Not content with that, Miami then wanted to propose to implement the second prong of the Cicero Institute legislation, and that is to create a permitted homeless encampment. Now, I think as many people know, there's really kind of two flavors of homeless encampments. There's a type that arises naturally as a result of community, and that's where people tend to congregate and they band together for safety and community purposes. Then you have another kind that's created by the government or perhaps noxious nonprofits that are in league with the government. Those are the evil kind, okay? Those are the kind that can rapidly turn into Korematsu type internment camps. And so we do not want those types, and that was the type that Miami had proposed. They were not proposing a permitted encampment site inside the confines of the city of Miami. They're going worse. And this is going to sound kind of ridiculous to us here, but this was taken very seriously at the time. They want to create this site on an island in Biscayne Bay, isolated from everyone. Okay, so essentially wanted to deport the homeless to an island. It gets worse, folks. It gets worse. So we all know about the Cicero Institute model legislation. I'll quickly go through this. The two major prongs were the bans on sleeping in public, which Miami passed, then the attempted encampment site. So let me tell you a little bit about this island, Virginia Key Island. The main thing about Virginia Key Island is that it's mostly a recreational area. There's no homes, there's no businesses on it. It's purely parks, paddleboarding, hiking, biking, and so forth. The very significant thing about Virginia Key Island is that it was historic Black beach. This was the segregated beach at which, because of Jim Crow segregation, Black people were consigned to this beach. The only beach that Black people could go to in Miami-Dade County was on this island. So it's been known as the Black Beach. The other interesting thing about this site that they proposed was to put this homeless camp next to a toxic sewage plant, okay, on the island. So add up other things here. It's on an island, vulnerable to the vicissitudes of the weather, next to the shore. In fact, if Hurricane Nicole had been there, they would have been much of the site was flooded right after Hurricane/Tropical Storm Nicole. Next to a toxic sewage plant, isolated from work, employment, from education, from the community. Okay, and the interesting thing, again, this was at the Black Beach. The interesting thing about this is that Miami's homeless population is 60% Black. So tell me that's not a coincidence that they wanted to reimpose Jim Crow segregation, deport a 60% Black homeless population to an island that is theirs anyway, so you might as well put them there. So that, I guess I'm speculating somewhat and looking into the minds of the commissioners that were doing this, but that's essentially what the situation would have been. So we organized a grassroots protest, and actually this was a multi-pronged protest. It wasn't just a grassroots organizing from the bottom up. I think as a commenter said, we had many people who were unhoused, who were sleeping on the streets as involved in the protest, because that's extremely important. It just can't be us talking heads. It's got to be the folks who are the victims of poverty have to be in the forefront. And so we got a lot of folks activated because of this, and they're frankly outraged. Okay. I and one other person, because I'm not that talented, put together this flyer here. This is a flyer that we put out, Say No to the New Jim Crow. I actually got a little pushback, a little flack. Somebody accused me of playing the race card. Like they always like to trivialize race relations as some type of card game. There's a lot of white people who are experiencing homelessness too. So what about them? So I was getting a lot of pushback over putting this particular flyer out. But the good thing about the flyer is that it brought attention to the problem. It prompted the conversation. I admit I got a little defensive at times, okay, about some of the racial pushback, but it educated people as to the racial disparities. Again, Miami-Dade County is only 18% Black, but the homeless population is 60% Black. And so I'd ask folks, does that mean that Black people are 3 times more likely to be mentally ill, 3 times more likely to be substance abusers, 3 times more likely to simply be lazy bums? And except for the extreme right wing, you're never going to tell them anything crowd that caused most people to think about it and to agree that perhaps homelessness is not a choice. okay, that there may be some other systemic issues, systemic factors involved in it. So we assembled a very broad coalition of groups. We got a petition available, okay, and we circulated it on change.org, I think it was. We got 17,000 signatures. Many of these are from the NIMBY people. They're not in my backyard people. People who didn't care about poor people, didn't care about homelessness. But as I said, we brought them into our fold, and many of them are still sticking around. We got intense media interest. All the outlets publicized this. And finally, we organized a rally of about 200 people finally showed up. And I'll quickly go through some of the photos. You see in the background, that building in the background, that's Miami City Hall. And so we had, this is the early stage of the rally. At one point, I think we had 100 people there. And we got very, very good media coverage. Oh, that's Paul Boden's shirt. I think Paul is on our panel, I hope. So that's me making some noise, wearing Paul's very creative t-shirt. And that's more of our rally participants. That's a co-director of or a board member of my organization, giving an interview to the Spanish media. And then here's another protester here. Finally, I want to mention this fellow here is a very interesting guy. He's his name is Benji Waxman. We got him to appear. He was the original lead lawyer in the Pottinger litigation from 30 years ago. Okay, as a young lawyer, public interest lawyer, just fresh from the public defender's office. He took on a case that no one else wanted to take on, and it became a landmark case, landmark in terms of principles of litigating against the criminalization of homelessness. So we got him to show up, and he delivered some remarks to our crowd. So that's the end of my slides here. The things I want to leave you with here are that it's not only the grassroots, and this is, as I said, a ray of sunshine. The city council, because of all the noise that they were making, decided to, quote unquote, indefinitely postpone the vote on a proposal to create this homelessness camp. So we won. It's still, technically, it's there. It could raise out of the grave like some zombie or something like that. But given the 17,000 signatures we got on this petition, all the noise we made, we think that's probably unlikely. But it wasn't just the organizing. There's the fact that we got Waxman there. We got the threat of litigation there. And so that was a huge threat as well. So thank you. This is just a case study on things that can go right. So Cicero is not impermeable. They can be defeated.
Thank you, David. Okay, next up, we have Lily Graham, who is a litigator with Disability Rights California and a former public defender. And Lily, I want to ask you about the patterns of coerced treatment that are playing out in modern approaches to homelessness. That's another aspect of the Cicero Institute's model policy. So take it away, Lily.
Of course. Start I'm Cicero Rights California. Thank you. We look at our advocacy through a disability justice lens. So the whole person, all of your identity, including marginalized identity, especially if there's intersections of that identity, and it creates further marginalization. Race, disability, if you're unhoused. So we look at the whole person. And so kind of going back to what the speakers have said, we look at the personhood, right? Who is the person? And I know a lot of the speakers have said we should be demanding these rights. And that is absolutely true, right? A lot of the legislation of criminalization, and I would say now the system impacted of civil justice system on the rights of people who are unhoused are creating, it's chipping away at people's personhood. So along with the National Homelessness Law Center and other orgs here, we just strongly opposed a new system in California called Care Court. And I'll get into that shortly, but you're starting to see that people's constitutional rights are being chipped away and looked at as an aesthetic rights versus human rights. That's what we're ultimately battling a lot of the times, right? Is aesthetic right versus human rights. And in Care Court, not only we're now fighting a civil legal justice system, which is a lower standard and much harder to pinpoint. So it's very close to a conservatorship. So if you think of your personhood in the civil context, your civil legal rights, you have about 6 buckets. If anyone followed the Free Britney movement, if you're familiar with conservatorship, the 6 buckets are your right to determine medical treatment medication, your right to contract, your right to socialize, your right to decide where to live, your right to make financial decisions. The 6th one is escaping me right now, but you have essentially 6 bucket rights. You look at conservatorship laws, those are the things at risk. And then you have the criminalization, and that's your right to freedom and liberty. So what we're seeing is under the Cicero Institute, they're trying to court order mental health treatment. So in care court, 2 of the essential rights that they're trying to remove from people is the right to determine where to reside, right? So I'm guessing you know where this is headed, right? If you take away someone's right to reside, where can you put them? And the second is the right to medical treatment, including psychotropic medication. That is in care court. So now we're seeing a chip. Actually, we've been chipping away at Olmstead for years. This is now a hammer to Olmstead, the Supreme Court case. So we're now seeing not just criminalization of unhoused people, we're seeing bringing them into the system. And in care court, and I'll give a quick intro, but there's probably a lot more detail here. So feel free to reach out if you have more questions. This year, the governor announced a brand new civil legal system in March of 2022. It was signed. It was just fast-tracked through the legislature, only 2 opposing votes, despite over 100 nation and statewide organizations opposing this horrible bill that was signed into law in September. It allows a wide range of petitioners, including your roommate, first responders, homeless outreach workers, people with 0 medical or clinical training, to decide if a person who they think has schizophrenia or other psychotic disorder can be dragged into civil court and ultimately be ordered to medical treatment, services, medication, and where they will live, including bridge housing. The biggest source of funding for care court in terms of housing is bridge housing. And if it's different in your state, I don't know every state. In California, bridge housing is typically shelter, congregate shelter, not non-congregate shelter. So we are worried that care court will be used to sweep encampments and warehouse people and put them under forced medication. So you're seeing the Cicero Institute creating this coercive model that puts people in court order care and housing. This, along with collaborative courts, which have been in existence for a long time, is sort of bringing the court center on the solution to homelessness in California. And so if we've been talking to behavioral health equity groups, folks that are on the ground, and they're saying behavioral health agencies are at a 30 to 40% vacancy rate. There is not enough people at this moment to meet the needs that they've been budgeted for. So imagine if you have a court mandated system, behavioral health must participate in, or they get fined up to, $25,000, I think. They can get fined on a daily basis, monthly basis for not participating. So now you have behavioral health court mandated to participate in care court. The likelihood of more services and programs and enforcement against unhoused people are going to be funneled through the through the court system. Now you're centering judges, you're centering law enforcement, and all those service providers that should be providing community-based services should be outreaching to people in their community where they're from. You now have it funneled through care court. And we know that's already happening, right? With collaborative court, we've had officers reach out to us and ask us, hey, what service should I refer to this person? most officers do not know what the best services in their communities are. So they ask us, we'll tell them, and they'll refer them maybe. But for the most part, even the well-meaning officers are citing people to get them into homeless court because that's the only place they know where services are being provided. And so kind of layered along what everyone else on this panel is saying, you have the NIMBY actions, you have the housing discrimination, everything that Professor Edwards talked about. As you see everything starting to get chipped away, I think our concern at Disability Rights California is the reinstitutionalization of people with severe mental health disabilities. And if you look at the rhetoric in the passing of care court during the legislative process, you heard legislators say, well, institutions are housing, right? And look, at least they'll be somewhere. Oh, at least they'll get mental health services. The other thing, just quickly, I wanted to point out, and I'm probably over time, but just want to point out is the racial justice component of this is massive. Schizophrenia is one of the highest rate of misdiagnosis and overdiagnosis in Black men. The schizophrenia diagnosis tracks with the civil rights movement. So there is a strong racial component to the specific diagnosis that has been named as the main mental health criteria for care court. And second is it centers behavioral health as being the only mental health services. And as we know, behavioral health has a racial and culturally competency issue for many Black, Indigenous, and Native Americans. And those are major issues within our mental health service system. And now instead of fixing those issues or reforming those issues, we're now saying this is the only solution and people must be ordered into this treatment. So there are many other issues with care court, but I think the Cicero Institute, where it's going for coerced mental health treatment is very concerning. You have this huge, massive criminalization, and now you have the civil justice system really pushing people to really have no existence, right? And so I think that is what we're fearing is happening in the near future.
Thank you very much, Lily. And now, without further ado, a man that very rarely needs any introduction, Paul Boden. Paul is the founder and director of the Western Regional Advocacy Project. And I know he hates it when I say this word, but whether he likes it or not, he is my mentor. And he's one of my very favorite partners in crime. I'm going to kick it over with a question to Paul, but first I just want to call out WRAP. That is the acronym for the Western Regional Advocacy Project, and Art Hazelwood. Throughout my PowerPoint, you saw a great artwork by Art Hazelwood. You see Paul wearing one of the WRAP shirts. You saw David wearing one of the WRAP shirts. The artwork that WRAP has is really transformative and helpful for all of your advocacy. So if you are doing direct actions, get with WRAP's artwork. And with no further ado, kicking it over to Paul Boden. So you're a young man in body and spirit, but you've been doing this work for a long time. So after 40 years of work, what historical patterns of discrimination do you see repeating themselves in today's policies on homelessness, including the Cicero Institute's policy?
Yeah, thank you. And I'll start off with a thank you for having me and inviting me to be a part of this. I came up from the street, so it's really never been, I don't consider what I do to be work, to be quite honest with you. I feel like I'm incredibly privileged. I get up every day and I get to do shit I believe in, and I get to be in community. And never a situation of, oh, well, now I got a gig, so I can't be who I used to be when I interact or when I'm with you, because now I'm in a different role. That's where they get us. That's, the way to kill a revolution is funded. And then the revolutionaries work for you. And I feel like the federal government, local governments have been massively effective at, you get loud, you get boisterous, you talk about change, I hire you, I fund you, and now you work for me. United Way, the whole fact that we address poverty as charity issues, bullshit. This isn't about charity. This is about systemic neoliberal issues that have been a part of this country, as you said, Tristia, since we came over here and stole the shit. And I say we because I'm a white boy in America. So like, since that time, when you look at the laws that are getting used, when you look at this chart, you know, anti-opiate, Jim Crow, ugly laws, the amazing part with the ugly laws was how blatant they were about it in the 1860s. No person who is diseased, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed so as to be an unsightly or disgusting object. That was on the books from the 1860s to the 1970s, when Chicago was the last city to take it off the books. How is that different from the broken windows laws and the other sitting on a sidewalk is illegal laws? How is that statement from the 1860s any freaking different? The cops, the cities, they all talk about it as tools in the toolbox to address whatever social issue they're choosing to address through oppression and through othering and through elimination of your presence in public spheres. And the 4118 in LA is a perfect example, but it ain't the first and it ain't gonna be the last. And when you look at Basurero treaties, when you look at ugly laws, when you look at sit-lie laws, like that's the systemic nature of the organizing. RAP is fortunate. We were created by local kick-ass, accountable community organizing groups. And we wanted to not hear our voices, hear the voices that were coming from our communities on the public sphere. The very first thing we did was our Without Housing campaign and the documentation of the massive wipeout of affordable housing funding. We've destroyed over 500,000 units of public housing since we started funding homeless programs. That's crazy. And how can you call something housing first when you have the federal government destroying 500,000 units that poor people live in public housing facilities? And then you're funding trinkets of dollars to the local service providers to do housing first. Go to the HUD budget, look for the housing first line item. It ain't there. And if the government is saying something's a priority or a model program and they ain't funding it, you know goddamn well it's a public relations campaign, which leads to point in time headcounts, which leads to stuff like HMIS. Those were all in the 2009 is when HMIS came into effect, because from the 80s to 2009, they realized the shit they were doing wasn't working. It wasn't making people disappear. So they changed the way they document it. And a lot of money went into 2 lines in a reauthorization bill at the federal level, which has now become a boondoggle for tech and consultants and technical assistance dweebs to be creating models of control in order to justify that something is being done. You're not restoring the funding for affordable housing, and you're not addressing human rights issues. You know, we did this poster around the 15-year campaign because we can't just talk about this is human rights and then 2 years later go to another conference and say, oh, we should listen to those with lived experience. This is 40 years down the road, folks. If you're still talking like that, you missed the bus and you should just get out of the way, because we've always been talking. We've always had, you know, skills. We've always had a passion to address these issues, and we don't need somebody to talk for us. We don't need a goddamn leader. Poor people got more leaders than they can shake a stick at. You know, we need support staff so that our voices and our priorities are what are reflected in the artwork or in the legislation. We've talked house keys, not handcuffs, because that's not just about homeless people. When you look at the gang injunction shit, when you look at loitering enforcement, you know, homeless people weren't the first to be the targets of these laws, and we won't be the last until the actual laws are overturned. So we wrote the Right to Rest Act. We've been running it in Oregon, Colorado, and California. Not even the Democrats are supporting the shit. But our thought is, and this is why the historical context is so important, We can call it Jim Crow. Well, Jim Crow was more oppressive. We can call it anti-Okie. We can call it sit high. We can call it broken windows. But if the laws that are being used are still on the books, they're just going to change the name and call it something else and continue to do it until they come up with, Gavin loves his care not cash, care courts. That's just the white liberal bullshit of how to push through racist and oppressive laws and oppress poor people and then divide and conquer through who you're funding and who you're not funding. And so, the bottom line is if people can't afford the rent, they shouldn't take our fucking tent. Like, if you can't say that proud and you can't say that loud, you're again missing the bus, man, because that's where it's going. We did this poster with all of our artwork is created with the organizers and the artists picking it apart and coming up with the right messaging. But when this went out to people in the street, which is where our t-shirts and our stickers and our posters are intended for and where they go when David calls up and says, we're having a demo, send me some shit. Stuff's put in the mail and it goes to David. It doesn't matter to us. This stuff doesn't do us no good sitting on our shelves. But when people living out in their tents that were fighting sweeps, man, this t-shirt flies off the shelf. This t-shirt speaks to the reality of people that are living in the street. And that's the only people we care about in terms of our messaging and who says our stuff is okay and who doesn't say it's okay. And then being out there with a house keys, not handcuffs message that we've had for years was to connect the housing issues that were there were two issues, all the rap member groups in Skid Row and Denver and Portland and LA and San Francisco. Like there were two things that Oakland that really impacted us was the lack of housing for poor people and gentrification and racism connected with housing. And the demonizing and the criminalizing of our existence with business improvement districts and pigs gone galore. And those two issues are not just homeless issues. Those are human rights issues. And it's been impacting community members for years, whether they're, there was a great example from the San Francisco Chronicle several years ago that had a bunch of Black men standing in front of an SRO, and the header, I swear, was, the homeless have housing, why do we still see them? Like that out, they talked about, oh, white liberal San Francisco. No, that's where the shit's at in cities across this country. And that's where we need to be understanding that this is connected. If they're treating us this way, they may not be treating you this way today, but they sure as hell will tomorrow. Sit-lie laws were originally created to remove gay and lesbian community members from the Castro and the Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco. And now you have gay and lesbian politicians supporting sit-lie laws because it's being used against homeless people. That's hypocritical, and that's the situation we're in. This piece of artwork, all the stuff that you can sort of see, I hope sticks. The immigration reform, contract with America, TANF reform, housing choice vouchers, like that's why there's homelessness. There's homelessness because there's neoliberalism. And the unfortunate reality is that we're all living Ronald Reagan's wet dream of neoliberal America. And we need to get serious about not just talking about how we're going to change this shit, but actually implementing our organizing strategies in a way that we're always speaking to the full community and speaking about the issues of the whole community and not otherizing ourselves. Thank you very much. I just talked a bunch of shit.
I love it. I love it. Now you can see why I love this man. And we've had amazing panelists. Big hand for our panelists. Now we have 8 minutes until it's time to start drinking. And I want to just announce a couple of things. One, the first CLE word is counter, for countering And the second is history, because that's what we're talking about today. We've got time for maybe a couple of questions. Who in the audience has questions? Don't be shy. This is not a shy panel. Alex. Our own Alex Matak, head of our legal defense clinic program here at the National Homelessness Law Center.
Thank you. Well, I'm just gonna, can you just? Here we go. I just wanted to get us started because I was really interested in the sort of very fleeting comment about getting the NIMBY people on board. And like, could you say more about that? Because it seems to me like NIMBY people would love to just put a bunch of people on an island where no one would see them and where they wouldn't have to see them. So could you talk about the tactics that you use to kind of bring them into your campaign?
Yeah, sure. Well, NIMBY people, the island is a recreational island. It's for hiking, biking, mountain biking, paddleboarding and the like. And they saw that as not only a direct threat to have a homeless camp there to disrupt their recreational activity, but they also saw it, and this goes back to my comment, 3 words, follow the money, okay? They saw this as a foothold, as an inroad for the developers to come in and destroy the island with development. Because that's essentially what our city commission wanted to do. There's always a buck element to all of these. No, I'm very proud, as a matter of fact, of all the things we've done with respect to this, is to pull in people who really couldn't care less, I think, initially about the poor. But we showed, in fact, I had some internal disputes among our organizers who didn't want them as part of our coalition at all. But I thought this was a way to both introduce people to the issues and to educate them, okay? Because a lot of people simply, walk past somebody who's homeless, sees them or doesn't see them, they're invisible people, Mark, and simply walks past them. And so this is a chance for us to educate. So we were able to pull in a certain number of folks. We showed that we had a common interest. We even got some pushback from a lot of those folks who, quite frankly, were put off by the name of our organization. Our organization is called the Miami Coalition to Advance Racial Equity. They were put off by that name. Okay, they didn't want to have anything to do with advancing racial equity or anything. Okay, and so I had a couple of people immediately drop out, but those are the folks that are going to be gone anyway. You can't convince them. But the vast majority stayed on because we had a track record. And I don't know if I can show you, if you look at that's from the protest from about a year ago. We had a track record of interesting, literally hundreds of people to come to protest at Miami City Hall. So we had a record to begin with, and they had heard of us, and so they stuck around. They came to our phone calls. We had bi-weekly calls. Usually had like two dozen people, maybe at the most. We had about 70 or 80 people on one call, where they all wanted to listen to hear what we had to say. And so we were able to pull in because of that nexus of common interest. Everybody hated this proposal to establish the camp, okay? And that's what got them in initially. But then we also convinced, I think a lot of them, or at least advance a proposition that folks aren't homeless because of choice. They're not service resistant. They're not shelter resistant. They're victims of poverty who are condemned to live on our city streets, okay? And it's not the people that are broken, it's the system that's broken. And I think we're able to convince a certain amount of people of that proposition. And to this day, there's at least a dozen out of the maybe 200 or 300 or so that variously joined our calls that have stuck with us. And they're now part of our coalition. So very proud of that.
Thank you. All right, we have just 3 minutes left, but there is a question coming in from our virtual audience. Hi, virtual audience. And it's to you, Mike. There's a question about the carceral nature of Project Room Key, which is a California statewide project. And we're wondering, in your experience, what can you tell us about that?
So as a result of the pandemic, Los Angeles and California started providing more resources for homelessness. One of them was Project Room Key, which is where the city or the county or the state temporarily leased hotels that were getting no business during the pandemic and brought people indoors. Then there's Project Home Key, which is where we purchased hotels, which is turning into long-term housing. Home Key is a much better program than Room Key. Room Key has been uneven, and it has really depended on who was running it. We've had some agencies that have done a great job, and most people who've been in it have been really pleased with it. And then there are other agencies which have been have had a very carceral approach, and people have not been allowed in and out at certain times. They've been expelled for all sorts of nonsense, and people have had real serious problems with it. One of the things that I think is important to note, that's ironic about it, is that you don't get no room key. You actually don't have the key to your room. It's not actually a place that you actually live. You don't have that sort of autonomy. You don't have that sort of dignity. You don't have that sort of privacy. So there are some places where it's been a lifesaver and has helped people, but then there's places where it's been a disaster and it's been really uneven. And Home Key is a much better model because it gets people off the streets for good.
Can I just add really quickly, as if we look at Project Room Key as carceral, also thinking about it as a quasi-institutional setting as well. People were locked in, they were not allowed to leave their rooms, they weren't allowed to step out of like the property because of good neighbor policies and things like that. So there is, to test institutionalization or institutionalization like setting, an activist once told me, does it pass the burrito test? If you were at any time wanting to go to the kitchen or go get a burrito from the kitchen or anywhere, can you do that? And that is the institutionalization test. Project Room Key did not pass that test for many people and many of these agencies that you're talking about. So that was one of the major issues that we're seeing when there's homeless programs being put out, that it then looks like institutional settings instead of having the liberty to, to recover and move into housing.
One other thing I should note too, because it speaks to the agencies and the unevenness of it, is there's a huge crisis in staffing up agencies in Los Angeles, whether it's mental health workers for services, or whether it's just frontline workers to staff places like a Project Room Key. The agencies pay horribly, and they have a really tough job, and they have a really hard time staffing. So they don't even get to the point where they get to even think about how do we do this better, because it's just such a scattershot system right now.
Thank you. And thank you for all of your comments today. One more final round of applause for our great panel.
All right, so this is the end of day one. If you are virtual, you've got your CLE codes. They've been given out. If you're here in the room, make sure you sign out. We'll have more sign-in sheets if you're getting for classes tomorrow. If you are getting CLE credit, you need to both do that, and you need to make sure you hand in your evaluation form or send it to me if you're virtual. And all the information for that is on the schedule page. One more plug for the Vehicle Residency Summit, vehicleresidency.org. If you want to sign up for that, that's going to be taking place on Friday and Saturday. And we'll be having our awards event later, and we've had some last minute cancellations. So anybody, even if you didn't register, you're welcome to come upstairs. That'll be at 5:30. And Representative Corey Bush will be there, Councilman Boden, Representative McCree, and Don and Tim. You get to see more of them, hang out with us, and otherwise, we will see you back here 8 o'clock for breakfast Eastern. For folks online, don't have to sign in until 9 o'clock. And that'll be when the official program gets started. But yeah, otherwise, thank you, and we'll see you tomorrow if we don't see you tonight.